Okay, saxophone friends, we're going to keep this a little simple, but simple does not mean not important. So this is a really big thing that sometimes, and well, always, we kind of neglect to talk about after we do it in 6th grade. So it's a good time to go back and review, and this is always an issue in saxophone land, is articulation and tonguing. Very, very often, saxophone friends get lazy and don't articulate the way you need to. So we're going to do a little bit of clarification and review for your now older self, rather than just having you remember back to 6th grade self what we learned back then. And we can talk a little more detailed since you're, older and wiser, and you know a little bit more about how things work now than what you did back in 6th grade. So the first thing is, when you're getting ready to start a note, your tongue is not the catalyst necessarily for what kind of articulation you do. Your air drives the articulation. Your tongue is just there to interrupt the airstream. More importantly, on a reed instrument, to interrupt the vibration of the reed, and to also release exactly when that happens. So we're going to start with the release. When you're getting ready to play, you need to be ready to play before it's time for the note. Your tongue, if your tongue is touching this reed, the reed can't vibrate, hence you're going to get no sound. When it's time for the note to start, you're going to release that air, okay? So you're going to get set, and you're going to have the air locked and loaded, okay? And then as you let go, and you can overdo this, and you hear little squeaks, there becomes a obvious over exaggeration of how this works for demonstration purposes, but it needs to be released. You don't want your air and your tongue to happen at the same time. Your tongue is there, and you're going to release the air. Okay, and again, maybe it's not perfect as you first really start practicing this. And for those of you who've been playing for more than a couple years, it can be really frustrating to go, oh my gosh, I just squeaked that and it came out an octave higher. It wasn't the right note. Who cares? Get this and practice through this, so then you can bring it all back into focus as you continue to practice. So work through that a few times. Get that air started. You're going to push the air and then remove your tongue from the reed to let the sound. Whatever sound comes out, okay? Do it a couple more times with me. Ready? And I'm just playing B because, again, it's a super stable note. Okay? There you go. So we're going to make sure and keep that air, load the air, and then release it with the tongue. Now again, with practice, this becomes much smoother. Now is the time in these next 6 weeks, or during these 6 weeks between our June and July camps, to practice this and make it more smooth, okay? And do that work now so it becomes second nature and it becomes into your habit toolbox when we come back in July. The next thing I want to focus on, and I want you to kind of revisit and really go back and think about, is that actual process and how you tongue, especially on saxophone. And this applies to clarinet as well, but it's more of an issue on saxophone because the mouthpiece is bigger and the mouthpiece and the tip of the reed is further in your mouth. And this is why saxophone players tend to get lazy on articulation. And we're constantly, Saxes, make sure you tongue that rhythm. Saxes, get the articulation. Saxes, don't slur that, it's tongued. Okay, you've heard that a lot from me and from Mr. Smith over the years. But this is why. It's not just because you as a person are being lazy. It's because the instrument is lending you to that, because it takes a little more work. So remember our phrase back from 6th grade, the top of the tip of the tongue touches the tip of the reed. So really think about what the top of the tip of your tongue is. This should make more sense now than what it did when you were back in 6th grade. So think of your tongue. I always use rather than I use my thumb to demonstrate. So remember, if if my thumb, imagine is a tongue, okay? You've got the tip, you've got the top. You want the top of the tip of the tongue is going to touch only the tip of the reed. So in a normal articulation, and you're in the middle of playing, you want your tongue is in the bottom of your mouth. It's going to come up, and the top of the tip is going to touch the tip of the reed. Okay? A really common issue that saxophone players develop is instead of using the top of the tip, you're using the top of your tongue. You're way up here touching the reed rather than the top of the tip of your tongue. Okay? If the tip touches, you're going to feel that real bad pinch, and it's going to feel like the reed is trying to bite the tip of your tongue. Okay? We don't want that. But you still might feel that on the top of the tip of the tongue. Okay? So all that good alliteration, tongue twister stuff, the top of the tip of the tongue touches the tip of the reed. The only real exception to this is on those legato or tenuto tonguings, on the do-do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do-do. You might have to move more to the top in order to make that happen, okay? Get my reed wet again. Notice when you get to the staccatos, it's not what my tongue is doing the same thing. It's in the air. The accents are in the air. And you're not going to tongue differently for a staccato or an accent or a marcato, the da or the dat. You're not going to tongue differently for that. It's all in your air, okay? So the thing I want you to focus on is work through the articulation exercise and the warm-up, so letter B, but think about what your tongue is doing. Slow it down. Okay, I'm not going to play the other note because this tenor saxophone's having problems, but you get the idea. And then you get the do. This is where you might change the area of your tongue. Doesn't have to change the area of your tongue though. It's more of just a lighter, barely touch the tip, and don't put as much pressure on the tip of the reed. Think ha, 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 but still touch the tip of that reed. Okay, that's a hard one to work on. Staccato tonguing can be very difficult on saxophone. Accents can be slightly difficult in another reason, and the fact that you don't want it to squeak. Practice accents without the tongue first. So it's all your belly. And then add the tongue into it. Okay, don't think of tonguing harder. It's got to be in your air. And then you just make it stronger air and shorten it to get those dats, to get those marcatos. Okay, now this is something, it's not a magic trick. It's not going to just magically happen unless you focus on it, unless you pay attention and listen to what you're doing. But again, like all of these exercises, 5 minutes, maybe 10, and doing this on a consistent basis, a few days a week, and every time you play, start thinking about where your tongue is and pay attention to the articulation. In the show this year, we know there's a lot of syncopation. We know there's a lot of ands. Those ands need to be accented. And saxophones have a lot of power in driving what that articulation sounds like. The really sound of the articulation is really going to come from saxophones and trumpets. So you really want to make sure that you're driving those articulations correctly and thinking about the area of your tongue. Remember the top of the tip of the tongue. And when you're starting a note, that it's a release, not a push. That's how you get a good, clean sound in the beginning. But it takes practice to not squeak it. Okay? So work through those things, pay attention, listen, think, and you're going to be awesome.